I'd like to start by saying that this evening marks two occasions, actually. One is, of course, DPU60, which for new students you wouldn't have been part of yet, and so we're very, very happy to welcome you to our year-long celebration of the 60th anniversary of the DPU. As you would have known, we've been running a number of events this year, and we very much wanted to get the best of all worlds, so we ran it across a year so that we could cover 2 academic years. So we're very, very happy that we can involve the new students this year in the DPU60 event. You would have heard us talk already about the conference, and on the website there's a range of different events and podcasts and photographs which highlight a lot of the issues and the events that we've run as part of DPU60. So please have a look at those. In fact, we have 3 more events left. This one in November and one in December, so please keep check, and we'd love to welcome you to all of them as we go through to the end of the year. The second occasion, of course, is World Habitat Day. So World Habitat Day is always the first Monday of October. It's a date that was established in 1985 by the United Nations General Assembly and was first celebrated in 1986. And each year, World Habitat Day, the aim of World Habitat Day is to, and I'll read the exact words, to reflect on the state of our towns and cities and on the basic right of all to adequate shelter. So it couldn't be more apt for our event this evening. And what is even more apt is that each year World Habitat Day has a theme. The theme this year is called Voices from Slums. And I would say that that has been a central theme in one way or another in the debates around housing policy, in the field of housing policy, and the contribution which the DPU has made to that field. Of course, also, I have to say, DPU60 wouldn't be a proper celebration if we didn't have an event on housing, because housing has been such a central core of a lot of the work of the DPU in the last 60 years. So it's wonderful for me to be able to welcome the panel. Perhaps I'll first draw your attention to the title, Back to the Future, which, as you can hear, has a certain provocative intent which is going to be underlying our presentations today, 60 years of housing policies. The format for the evening will be that Jorge Fiori will start off and lay out, if you like, the frame and respond to, explain, I suppose, the title, Back to the Future. And then I will ask the panelists to respond, 10 minutes each, and then we'll open up the floor to you, because we'd really like to have a conversation this evening about this very important topic, and we'll come back to the panel as we go through the evening. So, Jorge, I call on you to set out the basis for our discussion this evening.
Hello, everybody. I'm grateful to Caren, Julio, the colleagues that organized this Dialogues and Development series, for inviting me to participate in the panel, and for this quite difficult task of trying to summarize in very few minutes 60 years of experience and critical thinking. It's difficult to do justice to such a rich, long history of critical thinking in connection to issues of housing, housing theory, housing practice in the developing world, particularly. For a variety of reasons, I would say it's a long and rich experience. It is one that involves a vast number of members of staff over the years, from Otto Koningsberg, the director and founder of Development Planning Union, through the work of people such as John Turner, for instance, one of the single most influential figures in the reshaping of housing policies in the 70s, the colleagues that are here, many colleagues that are not here, some that are sitting here, like Michael Safier, but people that were very much involved in the debate about housing, the late Chopa Dancy, Baba Muntas, Nabil Hamdi, Jeff Payne, David Satterthwaite. Is a vast list of people, not to mention all the very young members of staff that have joined the DPU that are also very much involved in issues of housing and housing policy. And it is difficult also because the DPU doesn't have a monolithic view on questions of housing. It's a very important thing to establish from the very beginning. It's an history also of internal debates, and that we'll not have time to review here. I'll try to focus in what I believe to be the central core contribution of DPU in terms of ideas, in terms of values in relation to questions of housing, and core ideas that I believe permeated most of the contributions within DPU. Another difficulty is the fact, I would argue, that housing was never a side show within DPU. I would argue that housing was indeed the driver of the critical thinking within DPU about the cities of the developing world, about questions of urban development, policy and planning. Okay? And in fact, that was not accidental. And that leads me straight, since we have a problem of time, to what I want to present to you as the key arguments. For me, what encapsulates in very few words the key contribution of DPU to the field of housing studies and to housing policy can be summarized in very, very, very short manner by saying that is the understanding of housing as urbanism. That was, in my view, the key contribution and remains the key contribution. The understanding of housing as a process, multiple, multifaceted, multisectorial, multidimensional, that in its multiplicity connects with the production of the city as such. Housing indeed, not just as urbanism, that housing as a most strategic driver of urbanism and production of cities. Now, if we, those of you that know me know that I'm not a fan of PowerPoints, but I'm just going to show a very few images to try to save words and hopefully time. Once upon a time, that's what was happening in the cities of the developing world. This is a project in Mexico from a little bit more than 60 years. This is a project also in Mexico for a bit less than 60 years. This is a project in Caracas from exactly 60 years ago. And this, in my view, materialized the dominant discourses and approaches to housing, to cities, to planning, dominant concepts of how to reach the scale of housing need and social need in the cities at the time. And this was the central target of DPU critique. The understanding that those approaches and the materialization of those approaches could not respond to the challenges of the real city and to the dimensions of housing need and social need associated with housing. Okay, one can say that DPU's critique could be summarized on 3 or 4 key questions. The sense that this was never producing the quantity that was required. It was never producing, and this was central to the critique, the quality of housing that was appropriate for people in need of housing and for the poorest sectors of the population. And the housing that was produced, more often than not, was not affordable to the very poor either. And that was a combination of political questions, lack of political will often, but also the inability to deal with the pressures of the market at the time. Okay? What became the focus and the object of analysis of DPU and most institutions and people developing a critical thinking about housing at the time is this. The real city that completely overtook the planned cities, the new housing projects, etc., etc. A real city that was self-produced, bottom-up, irregular, this real city that became conceptualized in the early 70s as the informal city. I'll come to that. But what I want to make the point is that this became, in fact, the object of the critical thinking at the time, not just in DPU. This is what informed the most important conceptual theoretical developments at the time in terms of new understandings of housing, new understandings of planning, far beyond just the informal. I would argue that, in fact, this helped to develop an understanding of housing that became relevant almost everywhere. That understanding of housing as process, as urbanism. Okay? And this became conceptualized in the early 70s as the informal city, the informal housing, informal settlements, the informal economy. The informal being a concept that tries to encapsulate the sense of activities, processes, people, physical structures, economic relations that happen outside the rules, outside the regulatory frameworks, okay, that are associated almost invariably with very low productivity of production, of houses, of habitat, of goods, of services, and not accidentally associated in the cities of the developing world with conditions of extreme poverty. What is interesting in that conceptualization, which was very much convergent with the work happening within the DPU, is the novelty in terms of the concept. There were several, we don't have the time here to develop, but I want to say one, beyond just the question of a much better insight of the place of the informal city in the context of the capitalist city of the developing world and its articulations with the formal city, was the radical question of looking at this not as an universe of poverty, destitution, and lack of dynamism, but very much the reverse, the understanding that the informal defined a space of immense resourcefulness, creativity, imagination, and that will have a devastating impact in terms of the reshaping of policies, of ideas about housing policies and policies, soon after, in fact. Okay, and those images are very familiar to all of you. Perhaps this one, I don't know if you are familiar, this is just a complex of squatter settlements in the city of Rio de Janeiro. Okay? It's from within this reality that John Turner in particular, who I mentioned before, developed his understanding of housing as a process. But what was interesting was not just this understanding of housing as a process, but understanding what made possible for housing to become really a process of creation, production of cities. Okay? That for him and for most of the colleagues at DPU became intimately associated with the question, in fact, with the theme of the habitat wall day that Caren just mentioned. The question of participation, the role of the users and local communities in the process of production of housing as urbanism, the inexorable need for their involvement to produce housing as urbanism. Okay? And the idea that participation was much, much more than just questions of self-construction or self-building. It was indeed related to questions of control, to the redesigning of the processes of decision-making and management in cities, to the redesigning, ultimately, of the state. And central as well to the containment of the pressures of the market in housing provision.
is that understanding of housing as a multiple process, housing as urbanism, and housing as being inexorably linked to the process of participation, control, to the questions of power in the production of housing in cities, that becomes central, in my view, to the contribution of DPU. We don't have the time to start looking at the impact of DPU in terms of policy regulation. And I know that Caren would stop me if I'm starting doing that because of the time. Okay, I just went perhaps just one-liners, because what I want really to concentrate is on the challenges presented by the housing, the dominant, what I believe to be the dominant housing policies of today. But in the way, there is a long history of at least 3 stages in the evolution of housing policy, certainly in the developing world, I would say 3 stages. In 2 of which I believe the ideas developed within DPU and in collaboration with many other institutions across the world developing a critical thinking were very influential, and one stage when I think there was no influence whatsoever. Okay, the first and most obvious is what happens in the 70s with the move from the conventional housing policies of mass housing production, that I made reference to with those images, to what became known as the non-conventional housing policy that mark really the detachment of the state from the systematic production and provision of finished houses, and towards policies that promote forms of housing production and provision which were very much inspired and informed by the reality of the informal, by the reality of the informal city. And those policies became materialized in the form of site and services programs and projects and slum upgrading programs and projects. We don't have the time to discuss. I will just say that decade was absolutely influenced by these new ideas. Those ideas contribute greatly to what can only be described as the paradigmatic shift in housing policy. It was a very rich decade, full of innovative ideas, and very, very poor in terms of results. I would say it is a decade of failures. In terms of reaching the scale of needing housing and the social needs associated with housing, it was a decade of failures. We cannot discuss here in detail why, but I would say, also important to note, is that the most interesting, challenging, and radical thoughts about housing emerging very much from within DPU at the time got completely lost in translation in their implementation as policies. Okay, and not least because those radical ideas define a space of contention and dispute ideologically and politically, where some of the main promoters of those non-conventional housing policies of the 70s, for instance, the World Bank, certainly had no sympathy of those more radical understandings of, for instance, the understandings about questions of participation, democratization in housing, etc., etc. But I would say it was a decade, very interesting ideas, very influenced by those ideas, but very poor in results. The next decade and a half, 80s and 90s, there is a massive shift in housing policy. And here I would say DPU had, and critical thinking in general, had very little influence. This is a stage that happens in the context of the domination, the hegemonic discourse of neoliberalism, in the context of policies of economic and political restructuring and globalization policies, where the focus was invariably, at all levels, but also in housing, in the institutional redesigning, in the institutional reform, with a view to enable markets as the true providers of access to housing, markets as the true instrument of scaling up in housing provision. And those institutional reforms were invariably about rolling back the state, about deregulating, about privatizing. This is a period of dematerialization of housing policies, if you want, but where housing policies became completely absorbed in the larger agendas of economic and political reform. There is a third stage in the 90s, where I think the ideas of DPU became quite relevant, where we in DPU and many colleagues and Ronaldo argued that there was a new generation of housing policies emerging, which returns to the informal city with programs and projects that are fundamentally urban projects driven by housing with new interpretations and understandings of scaling up that are much more sophisticated and much more interesting. I have no time. I've been told by Caren that the time is running out. But I think some of those programs and some of those policies came the closest to the materialization of an understanding of housing as urbanism, are the ones that have carried greater potential. We can discuss later through the questions that you might raise in relation to that. I'm sure that Ruth, that has vast experience in relation to those types of programs and projects, will be talking about that. I would say, nevertheless, that again is a period full of shortcomings despite the potential. But I want to have a few minutes to focus on really, for me, is the key challenge, which is the resurgence in the last few years across the world, not just developing, also developed, of mass housing policies again under the label of social housing. This marks a return to some very old questions in conventional housing policies. One, very important, the use of housing policies fundamentally as an instrument of macroeconomic policy, and the use of housing policy in the context of anti-cyclical measures to deal with the threats of recession, particularly after the global financial crisis. Also, the return of the central national state in housing policy in a way that we haven't seen in many parts of the world for a very long time, when we had decentralization of housing policy towards local authorities and local governments. But with one fundamental difference, and this is the crucial one. Those policies invariably, from Mexico to South Africa, from Turkey to Brazil, Argentina to wherever, Thailand, okay, and there are developed countries as well following those policies, but we'll not discuss here. They are entirely private sector and market driven. That is the fundamental difference. Housing policies that are accelerating and accentuating the commodity nature of housing. And the fundamental difference in the role of the state here is that if in the 80s and the 90s the state was enabling markets through a rolling back of the state, here what we see is the state proactively, decisively, forcefully, and with immense amount of resources trying to create the conditions of commodification of housing. The other novelty is that the quantity is immensely, infinitely higher than anything that was done in the past. Okay? And what we see now is shocking? No. Is that in terms of quantity, we have kilometers and kilometers of boxes being produced in the periphery of cities almost all over. Okay? Much larger quantities, but attention, this time it's also having a social reach that it didn't have before. There are segments of the population that are having access to this housing that in the past had no access to housing through the market. And in certain countries like Brazil, that I would say is the exception, where the political will exists to subsidize considerably these housing projects, the sector that benefited the most is in fact the lowest income sector. So there are many novelties here. But the quality of this marks a substantial decline in quality, not just because of the architectural poverty of those boxes, not just, and sometimes it's horizontal, sometimes it's vertical. If you go from Shanghai to Mexico, it will change, but invariably it's the same. It's this peripheral development of houses where there are very substantial environmental problems, but the key, most important deficit is the urban deficit. This is production of boxes in large quantities with the loss of the city. Okay? That is the key question. And what is at the core of this? Once again, the old question of land and land markets, and the freeing of land markets. Over decades of rolling back regulatory frameworks, institutional instruments to control land markets that almost everywhere have been rolled back, with private developers buying masses and masses of peripheral land, promoting a speculative logic of production of housing and the city, which only accentuates the traditional spatial and social segregation in the city. This becomes affordable, I would argue, fundamentally through one mechanism, is the production of degraded commodities. What we are seeing, we have a colleague in Argentina, a friend of Julio, Pedro Pires, who argues in an article about Mexico, very interestingly, that what has been happening there is exactly this question of a logic of commodification that comes hand in hand with the production of degraded commodities as a way of making this housing affordable, even to segments of the population that didn't have access before. In the case of Mexico, certainly not the very poorest. In the case of Brazil, yes, because the other mechanism of affordability is, as always, the question of subsidies if the political will exists. I put to you, is this just the failure of critical thinking? If 6 years later what we see is this? And I would say, bring back Mario Pani, the architect of those projects I showed you in Mexico before. Those projects were much more interesting and more sophisticated than what is being done at the moment. Okay. Is it the failure of critical thinking, or critical thinking still has a place, DPU still has a place? I would argue that yes. I would argue that the central messages and the core of DPU's contribution in the understanding about housing as urbanism, the different role of the state, the question of participation as control and power, the question of scaling up, fundamentally understanding of scaling up as a process that is inexorably multidimensional, multi-sectorial, multi-programmatic, that has to articulate the multiple scales of the city and the city region to really scale up. Scaling up that is fundamentally about a change of quality in the city is not a quantitative question. And the change of quality is not just through urban projects that requalify particular territories of the city, but is the requalification of the relationship of those territories with the surrounding conditions and with the city region at the multiple scales, which are physical, are spatial, but are also economic, political, institutional, and social scales. This is the question. And the core challenge of that remains, as always, the question of the construction of the political institutional framework of cities that can give account of these transforming relations across territories. It is ultimately about the political institutional redesigning. This is not a question of purely physical interventions. It's fundamentally about the politics of the cities, about the politics of housing. And here I finish with the subject of the Habitat World Day, which, again, that transformation of the political institutional frameworks cannot come about if it's not through embedding our search and construction of alternative housing strategies in the practice, social and political practices of local communities, of the users, to the process of democratization of the structures of decision-making and management in the city, okay, and this redesigning of institutions. On a positive note, or positive, optimistic note, I would say, do we have to wait another 60 years to see what will happen? I hope not. To see changes happening, I hope not. But perhaps I finish with a positive note informed by a very negative comment. I would argue that this is a massive, massive time bomb. For those of you that have seen The City of God, a film about a housing estate in Rio de Janeiro, a famous housing estate called The City of God, what I think will happen is that we will see more and more a multiplication of cities of God throughout the world. And if you have any doubt, if you want to have a glimpse of the future of these policies, just look at Chile, which has been undoubtedly the laboratory of neoliberal experimentation in the field of policies in general, but certainly in the field of housing policies, and see what is happening there when the state is actively demolishing the housing that was built and the housing estates and projects that were built, and exactly the type of policies that today we see spreading through the world. This, for me, is where the biggest challenge lies, but goes back to the old issues that DPU has been raising for a very long time. I'm sorry for exceeding by 2 minutes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
So I'm going to call on our panel members to respond from their particular perspectives, and then we will open up the discussion. Let's start with Pat.
Well, George doesn't leave much to be said, does he? But what I would like to do is to talk a little bit about look at some of the implications of the strategic implementation of the sorts of policy, public sector policies, government policies for urban housing that we've seen over the last 60 years. Let us remember, though, that it is not a long period. The last 60 years, since the early 1950s, has been one of enormous experimentation of public sector intervention in housing, in urban housing. Prior to the 1950s, the production, maintenance and management of housing was an entirely private sector affair. Government's role in this was some of regulation and control through planning and building regulations, land use controls and zoning, and things like this. And it wasn't until, as George has pointed out, wasn't until the early 1950s that governments started to recognize that they had a role, that the public sector had a role to intervene in this private sector market. But it was still in terms of the commodity, or housing as a commodity. And that's where in many of the countries in the late 1950s and the early 1960s of Africa and Asia, recently achieving political independence, and the new economic growth in Latin America, which occasioned enormous and rapid increases through migration to increases in urban populations, that governments became aware of the necessity to intervene in a market that was clearly failing. And this is where the first of the illustrations that he put up from Mexico, Brazil, was the first intention. Public sector intervention in the production of housing had hitherto been limited to the provision of accommodation for some public sector employees, notably the military. Barracks and cantonments was really the only large-scale publicly built housing, or publicly commissioned housing, that has existed up until this point. And this was seen as a process of construction. It was an engineering activity. So when governments saw that they were, started with the 1961, I believe, the 1961 round of national censuses, drew attention to the enormous rate of growth of informal housing, that is, housing that had been built by those people who could not afford to construct what was termed legal housing, that is, complying to the standards and regulations imposed by government, and had to and did build their own neighborhoods, developing in the process their own communities. So what to do, and it was about this point, it was 1966. Jorge Fiori has mentioned the paper produced by John Turner and Rolf Goetz at a conference in the University of Pittsburgh in the United States, in which he pointed to the efficiency and efficacy of the informal housing production and management process that governments were battling against, making this case very strongly that such a process of the production of accommodation and workplaces solved many more problems than they created. And I think this is important to understand that at this point, the time-bomb point that George mentioned, that we are aware of what has been done, what has been tried, what has succeeded, what aspects have succeeded, what aspects have failed or not succeeded. Following the publication by the United Nations Development Programme of the paper by John Turner and Rolf Goetz in 1969, I think it was actually published. It was published before that by the Journal of the American Association of Planners. Started to look at for the first time, the strengths and opportunities provided by the deregulation or of controls that were imposed by the formal private sector market in the production of houses. And so they started building either these little boxes or these massive high-density apartment blocks for the lowest income groups, which fairly fast ran into major difficulties, social difficulties of conviviality to which people were not accustomed, and difficulties of maintenance and management, which remained the responsibility of public housing departments or ministries. And so a review was occasioned, and this is mentioned by George, of how to engage the productivity of households and low-income communities in the development of their own dwellings and workplaces, whilst maintaining a politically and socially acceptable standard of construction, standards of amenity, and standards of health, and so on. And so we then get, throughout the following 2 or 3 decades, a series of shifts in approaches to strategic approaches to the implementation of non-conventional housing policies. A policy is a fairly easy thing to do. It is a statement. And with a small political change, you can have a complete change of policy. What really tests the strength of a policy is the changes in legislation that will enable it to be implemented and the processes by which it is implemented. This is why I think it's important to get beyond the policy, to look at the implications of what happened on the ground, because very often there is a major mismatch between them. Though, as Caren said when she introduced, what was your catchphrase? Looking back to the future.
Back to the future.
Well, I think I think it's looking forwards into the past very often. We're not really looking to the future, because we've got a lot of experience to draw on now that in the 1970s governments didn't have, and we intellectually or contextually did not have. So it is not starting again, or it is starting again, but starting again with a new set of understanding and new sets of tools, which I think is important. Anyway, let's go quickly through the informal approaches at a program and project level that started roughly 60 years ago, at the time of the foundation of the DPU. The first approach was mercifully fairly short-lived, and that was an approach of organized self-help, which at the time was generally termed assisted self-help. And this was promoted very much by the then new United States Agency for International Development, recently established in the early 60s by the Kennedy government under largely the Alliance for Progress program in Latin America, particularly in Brazil and Colombia, and a bit in Venezuela, but also in several cities in Asia, notably in Indonesia and in Philippines, in which housing authorities or public sector housing departments or authorities set out to engage the future occupants or beneficiaries of public housing in the construction of housing with two aims. The principal aim was to reduce the cost of construction, to make it more easily affordable, to reduce the level of necessary subsidy, and also with a subsidiary objective of creating a vehicle for social interaction of people who would be living together when projects were completed in the same neighborhood. Unfortunately, by and large, this approach failed. Under this approach, housing authorities would plan, design housing projects. Some of them really very large, quite substantial. And then advertise and or allocate dwellings to households who met various criteria of levels of poverty and of housing need, who were then assembled as work groups to construct their future dwellings. So then there was a return to the principles of John Turner and Rolf Goetz of looking at and exploiting or getting in on the act of the informal urban development processes. And this was taken up very strongly in the early 1970s, particularly by the World Bank and the regional development banks, the Asian Development Bank in particular, the African Development Bank less so, and the World Bank itself, through the creation of new neighborhoods, largely on the urban periphery, through sites and services projects. Sites and services was crudely drawing the distinction of the first stages of some level of understanding of subsidiarity. At what level are things most effectively done and decided? And the crude distinction here was that the assembly of land and the installation of infrastructure and the provision of public services were activities that are best undertaken at the level of the city at least. And that actually the design, construction and investment of time, energy and resources, financial resources in the construction, the superstructure of dwellings is best and most effectively undertaken by the occupying or future occupant communities and households. Together with this were programs of upgrading existing. It was called slum upgrading. Whatever anyone's definition of slum is really irrelevant. Everybody has an idea what it means to them. And to most national governments and municipal governments, it meant any informal settlement, whether there was a high level of environmental deprivation or not. That programs, instead of clearing them, to upgrade them, still very much in issue with a view to the installation of the hardware, the infrastructure that would, it was argued, stimulate households to improve their own dwellings. I tended to assume, and still does assume, that low income, the occupants of low income neighborhoods are communities, which is not always so. In fact, it is very rarely so. The idea, the conception of a traditional rural community built up by traditions of hierarchies of leadership and custom rarely exist in low-income urban neighborhoods. And so it was only relatively recently in the whole upgrading process that public housing agencies have taken on board the importance of providing supports to community development and the development of community organizational and operational management skills, which I would argue is a central component of any upgrading or indeed any new development, any new participatory housing production process. Pick up more in the discussion. What I would like to talk about is where we go next with this experience.
So you can see that we have a fantastically rich experience here. And so, Ruth, I'm going to ask you to reflect perhaps on a more contemporary setup, because I think we've had a lot of very strong and good historical overview of the situation.
Okay, I'm going to be quite quick. I hope. And I, in a sense, I want to go. Many years ago, when I was a student, there used to be this in the winter, about this time of year, there used to be mists. And I can remember making my way back to my place where I lived across this common. And you would get into this mist and you'd think, oh my God, where am I, where am I? And fortunately, in the middle of this common, where the two paths crossed, there was a lamppost. And on the lamppost, somebody had very carefully painted reality checkpoint. And it was something you always sort of valued as a student, that you knew you were going in the right direction. I want to sort of think a bit about the theme of today's World Habitat Day, the voice from the slums, being a reality checkpoint. Because at the end of the day, it is still the case, as it was 60 years ago, that the majority of housing is built by poor people and lived in by poor people and is not touched in any way by what we consider the formal world. So it's out there in the photos that George showed you, and it's all over the place. And it will be very, tempting to say, okay, we understand that sprawling mass. But in fact, we don't understand that sprawling mass at all. We're extraordinarily ignorant about what happens in that mass. So we're very good on things like formal land markets, and we're quite good on financial markets. And we can talk about financial markets being shallow or narrow or, you know, all that kind of talk. But most of the time, we don't actually know what's going on in the majority of the settlements that are in fact called informal or unplanned. And therein lies a reality check challenge, because therein lies a massive diversity of experience and options and strategy. And it, as I get a bit older, being over 60, as I keep telling everybody very proudly, one of the things I think back to, oh, if I was younger now, what would I most like to do to find out about the city and about housing? And there's a couple of trails that I would love to do. I would love to go to a whole series of cities and spend a week with a pit latrine empty. I'd like to know how toilets get emptied in a city and what happens to that effluent and how does all of that get coped with. I'd like to look at solid waste recycling and where does that all go. And to kind of find the patterns that connect all the different elements that actually make up housing in a way that makes sense as a survival strategy for people living in the city. And I think if we gave a little bit more attention to looking at what people were trying to do and how they were trying to do it, we might be a bit more successful in devising policy responses that facilitated that more greatly. One of the patterns that I see quite strongly, and I suppose it's one of my responses, and George won't be surprised at this response, is that if we're not very careful, we can fail to see the diversity that exists. We can talk about developing countries, or we can talk about this is what's happening in housing. But I look at George's photos and I say that's a completely different world from Freetown and Sierra Leone. You know, nobody's building little boxes for people in Sierra Leone. There are poor people desperately trying to take sand from the sea to create land on which to build shacks that they are probably going to rent out to other people. It's a completely different reality. And so context is everything. And if we create a situation, which I think does tend to exist at the moment, where we have massive diversity in the survival strategies that are pursued by people in slums or on the ground, but we respond to that in a way that's a homogenized policy response, then we enter the realms of the frankly fantasy land. I mean, I think this is Vanessa, I can't remember her surname, but from South Africa has read about this, but we've all seen it. You know, you can go onto sites and look at the future development plan for somewhere like Freetown, and you will get the most fantastic, you know, schemes of little boxes or high-rise developments or on the edges of the city, and they're never going to happen in a lot of those contexts because the resources don't exist. The government doesn't have the capacity to impose its will, and so this. I think you're dealing in many contexts in Asia and Africa with a far more apparently chaotic situation, which in a sense has its own order, but we don't know a lot of the time what that order is. And I would desperately hope that those of you who are going into this whole area will explore and understand and dance with that level of chaos, because I think if we repeat the same sort of let's make a policy to help poor people to work out approach, then we are seriously doomed, and we will have, you know, cities of God in Freetown and everywhere else. So I'm going to, you know, I could say lots of other things, and I'm very aware that I haven't talked about lots of the approaches that I think hold a lot of hope based on helping people to collectively respond to the context they're in and create new solutions that other people haven't thought of. But maybe that'll come up more in discussion.
Thanks, Ruth. So, Ronnie, you have the last word on the panel, and then I'd like to have some time just to go to our audience as well.
What am I going to say?
Ronnie, I've never known you stuck for words. So.
Everything about this case is sorry if I stand up. If I talk to you sitting, have the impression that I am at home, having lunch with somebody and talking quite without any discipline. Everything which has been said here, I think, is right. Even things that appear contradictory, they are right because this is a contradictory field. There are different experiences, there are different realities, etc. I think it's very difficult in this type of overall view to come with something different, because the field has been very well covered. The different experiences, the different realities, and the way in which one can look at the particular policies which have been going on. I'm going to do something I've been thinking. What extra can I say after all this? Probably, sorry again, probably there are hundreds of subjects, but the essence of what happened in the field of housing has been already presented to you. So what about something personal? Okay, I am 80 years old. I started dealing with housing when I was 26 years. It's a lot of time. Okay? And I started because one of my teachers in the Faculty of Architecture took us to a shantytown, and we had never been in a shantytown at that time. Even a shantytown at that time was a very dangerous place. You didn't go there. I've been going in a bus in front of the shantytown every day. I never had idea what was a shantytown. When I went to that shantytown, it changed completely my life. So from 26 to now, even to today, when I was looking at my notes again, I've been dealing with this subject. One have to keep in mind that every different step in the field of housing doesn't eliminate, doesn't erase the past, because the past continues. The first reaction that came after that was when governments started in the 40s looking at the possibility. That was governments that were more progressive governments. They were left-wing governments. Let's put it very clear. Left-wing governments where people that were dealing with this were silly people, taking funny ideas of freedom, of equality, of respect for people. Those governments took the view that the whole policies should apply to everybody in society, but because that was impossible, they classified the people in society. They classified, for example, one of the most important classifications was according to income. Okay, and according to income, part of the population was below the poverty line. Okay, now most of the policies that were done at the time were launched with the idea that housing, and not only housing, any other activity, will be very much concerned with the people being under the poverty line. Never happened. Okay, most of the housing being constructed at the time, because the idea was a house is a house, is a building, it contains a number of items there, it contains technology, is a commodity, And the government could reduce the value of the commodity. The value will take part of the price of that commodity, but the majority of the houses being constructed by housing policies in most of the third world countries between the 40s and the 60s, not the majority, but a large part of that, probably the majority, went to people that in fact could afford to put some money into the buying of those properties. Most governments had a sort of, gesture about the policies. They have the poverty line, the poverty queue. I mean, if you were very poor, you could go and register, okay? And there was a long list of people waiting in the queue. Every sometimes, the government will build certain amount of houses, and 2 or 3 of these houses will go to the people in the queue. The first, the second, the third, okay? To summarize that, I will not continue with the faults in there. To summarize, my point is this. The whole history of housing, has been, in fact, a progressive position concerning poverty. Okay? All what our friends here are presented show very clearly how, at the beginning, slowly, more and more, the policies of housing were taking care of incorporating more people that were poor people. Okay? For example, the first policies that were dealing already with the production of houses, all the criticism we can do, the fact that they were only concerned with the houses, not with the people, were a contribution and improvement in relation to the past. When the people started invading land and occupying land, and the governments have to cope with that, and quite cleverly accepted the possibility that people was right in occupying land and building their shacks, and government started helping, providing policies of informal housing that allowed in different ways those people to get some benefit. That was a positive step again in favor of poverty alleviation. And finally, I have to add to this presentation a very, very personal point. I have a great resentment with the DPU. Okay? What about that? What about that? My great resentment with the DPU is that DPU closed the master course on housing for development. Okay? And I think that that is a contradiction of what everybody has been saying today here. Thank
you. So, folks, we have a picture of housing as urbanism to a somewhat more desolate picture now. It's housing in its current form as, I think Jorge Fiori referred to it as urban deficit, which is a very different kind of vision of housing. So let's open up for a few questions. Anybody would like to offer some comments or ask some questions? We have a little bit of time for that.
I want basically to make 2 comments based on the presentation by Jorge Fiori. So one is the idea that you said that at the beginning, like let's say that before at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, there was this private mass housing with the name company towns. So like housing providing by the industrialists to let's say house the workers. And then in the 50s or after let's say the World War II, it was the state division or the so-called social housing. And now it's more or less a joint, for me, situation where it begins from the state, but it's the private sector that has built it. So you have to basically do something that satisfies the state, the government, but it is produced by private sector, so it has to satisfy the profit. And especially in Latin America, like in Asia, I don't know much, but in Latin America, it is very much that the government starts with the vision that actually, if you ask residents, they are really like very much looking forward to these new houses because they are really aspiring that because of the conditioning of the advertisement of the home ownership, that it is a very like privilege for the first time. But then you have the private companies that like following the brief, we have like the minimum requirements and very like little boxes and everything. So it's sometimes, I don't know if it's a confliction between what the government wants and what the private sector can offer within this brief. And again, what the initial fantasy or dream it is by the residents and what they end up living. Because they begin with all these aspirations that we want to have a house on our own, and we end up remotely in a periphery with no job. And this is the one comment. And the second
Ask you to be short, so other people can.
Super short. You said about at the end about City of God, and whether all these like examples and implementation will end up being City of God. The interesting with City of God is that it started as a housing program, mass housing program. It ended up being super deprived and like notorious, and now is really making up again, like really getting as a really bottom-up procedure by the residents itself, is kind of getting to be adaptable and resilient again. So is that a future so negative?
My commentary briefly would be, starting from the second comment, do we have to go through all that painful process? No. Many years later to see some ray of hope? Is that the way to move forward? Now, on the first question you raised very briefly, the private sector has always been involved in the production of public housing. It's the nature of the involvement that changed. Those houses, housing projects of the 50s and 60s in Mexico, Caracas, etc., everywhere in the world, if you look in Asia, they were always built by private sector, and they made profit. It was not a loss exercise. What changes the nature of the private sector involvement? Now, the difference is that those policies are private sector driven in the sense that the bulk and mass of the housing that is produced is initiated by the private sector. The procurement starts with the private sector and follows entirely a logic of the market where there is mega profits to be made, particularly through a process of land speculation. Now, it's true, the state many times tried to ensure that the quality is relatively acceptable. But this is the question. I think the difficulties we face today, and that's why it is so challenging. I insist, the numbers are monumental. I fully agree with everything that has been said. I fully agree with Ruth in terms of the real ways in which cities are produced, and we have to keep looking at that, and we have to try to provide alternatives at the level of policy that have that diversity and richness. But the fact of the matter is that we are faced today, and not in one, two countries, not in one continent, across the world, with this resurgence of policies that are producing large quantities. Mexico alone, since these photographs are from Mexico, is producing more than 500,000 a year. Brazil, the first stage of a policy that started in 2009, has produced in the first stage 1 million, the second stage 2.5 million, and the third stage to start in the after the second round of the presidential elections next year, 3.5 million. In few years, the housing deficit, in inverted commas, would have disappeared. And yet, the time bomb is there. Okay, and the question of the expectations, you're right, this is the question. Brazil, if you talk to the Deputy Minister of Housing was here last week, if you talk to her, she would say, the paradox is this: economically has been a success in terms of activation of the economy and employment. Socially, the bulk and mass of the population loves it, okay? And yet, we know that this is a time bomb. on all the grounds that we discussed before, but particularly this loss of the city in the majority of the projects. Now, how do you deal with the expectations? The private sector knows how to do it. So look here, the photograph doesn't show, I have many photographs. If you start getting close to these, that has no schools, no basic infrastructures, no services, has no clinics, often has no transport, but yet there is an electronic gate, because this is designed as a gated community to deal with those expectations. And people initially, they might love for a few hours, but soon enough, when reaching schools, clinics, employment, etc., becomes an issue, that's when it becomes a city of God. And the challenge we have is that those experiences are massive, the numbers are massive. People, as you say, often look forward to it, likes it. Okay, we have a rolling back of the instruments of policy that could have dealt with this, that are not dealing with this. We have the massive problem of the relationship between central, national, state, implementing the policy and the local state. Okay, but there is one, for me, one most challenging problem that I couldn't elaborate before, is that today, left, right, and center, from extremely conservative governments to very progressive governments, they all converge on the idea that the market-driven, property developers-driven solution is the only possible. And this creates a mega obstacle in terms of transforming those policies. It's extremely, I think it is. We have a much greater insight, I think Pat said that before, we have a much greater insight today. But the challenges we face are much more complex than anything that we faced before. And Ronaldo is right, this comes about not for lack of ignorance. 6 years after continuous debate about housing as urbanism, about all those issues we are discussing, about the informal, etc., and just at the very moment when for the first time in the history of housing policy came somewhere near the idea of housing as urbanism through those programs and policies that I made quick reference we couldn't develop. But at the very moment when this is happening, all of a sudden it is as if when you gain the houses, even if houses as boxes, you lose the city. And often when you gain the city, we have also lost the houses. And this is another debate that perhaps another time we can have. This is also, and this pendulum is an extremely challenging one. But anyhow.
Let's pick up a few more questions and comments. Can I ask you just to keep them short, if you don't mind? Yes.
Really short. I was just wondering if Ruth could expand, or anyone really, could expand on some of the policies that we think are working. Because we've had a bit of a dire picture, and you hinted that there might be something you felt more positive about.
Okay. Any other questions along the same lines? Yes.
I heard from my father that Chinese government is going to clean or do something about the illegal housings in the cities, and in the meantime, they are going to take the rapid urbanizations and facilitate rural migrant to cities. I wonder, it's a big deal. I wonder what advice will you give to? Okay. Because every time we do something, it's a big deal.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It is. It is. Okay. So we talk about that conflict. Yes.
It's very quick. Seeing these pictures, I remember the assumption that the road is flat. So I'd like you to comment on it, because that's how it looked like.
It certainly does look quite flat. Yeah.
I was wondering if, from what I'm getting, it seems that there are only houses for miles and more miles. If you include within the private initiative other kinds of services like clinics, schools, maybe universities, something that configures that as a city as well, would that be a kind of solution? If you integrate also transport.
I think the reason, the question to ask is why isn't that already there?
Yes.
And I think that's another question. Yes.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if we think about housing as a physical, I think would it be better if you think of housing as a concern to the people and how people govern themselves and related to the governance of the context of the housing and settlements. I was wondering if there's a comment because in Indonesia there is a city named Surabaya, and I think it's very works about the improvement of the informal settlement, low income settlement, something, and it starts from the collaborative governance in the city. It starts from the major and yeah.
Well, perhaps I can, perhaps we can just ask Ruth to respond to that, because it also responds to Elizabeth's comment about a more cooperative, a more collective kind of approach to these problems, which is slightly different from the market-driven kind of approach.
Yeah, I think the exciting thing about housing is that it brings together a number of incredibly strategic elements. So if I can remember in Mumbai dealing with pavement dwellers, who of course were saying what we want is decent housing. But when they then sat down and discussed what's the first step in getting to decent housing, they said what we need is ration cards. Doesn't make any sense, does it? But to them it did, because until they got ration cards, the place they already existed in was not being recognised, and that meant they weren't recognised, which meant they weren't citizens, which meant that they couldn't be a legitimate part of the city. So strategically for them, the first step towards housing was actually being recognised as living somewhere in the city and having rights to the city. And so what I see working now in places where it's working, and in some ways it's just getting so exciting because people can do it so much better and so much faster, is where people living in informal or unplanned settlements are creating information which they are negotiating with on a systematic basis in terms of city authorities, or in terms of private landowners, or in terms of others. And they're doing it around what I would call the strategic elements of housing. The biggest of those is land. Right? Land is absolutely massive. So whereas if you read, Sonsul Bunyabancha about Bangkok, she will say, what the government used to say is, well, we'd like to do all this, but there's no land in the city to build for poor people. And what did poor people do? They went out and mapped the land. And they shared that information about what land actually was available, and they researched who owned it. And you're seeing more and more of this beginning to happen, where people now have access to the technology, they have the strategic alliances with people like yourselves, who can help translate a lot of that information into language that policymakers and people allocating city resources can deal with. And who is a citizen and who can participate in the discussion about what composes acceptable approaches to housing is beginning to change, and it's becoming a much more of a sort of political issue. But I do think that does vary with the context. That's happening at different rates in contexts where national governments have resources or don't have resources. We talk merrily about applying subsidies for housing, but there's loads of countries that just can't provide subsidies for housing. The macroeconomic realities don't allow for that to happen. So what does a government do in that context? What does it do with land? What does it do with providing other kinds of incentives to people to actually collectively organise or to deal with fairer rental markets, for instance? 80% of residents in cities like Nairobi, I don't know if I could name Lusaka, and so they rent. They don't own. And so if you don't deal with the rental market and the rental realities, and hardly any policies do, then you're not dealing with 80% of the population. So I'm getting into rambling now. But I think it's about information, and I think it's about a recognition that the urban poor are not resourceless. They're actually pretty resource rich, and the technology is changing their capacity to actually intervene and become active players. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that.
I'm going to ask our panels to make some short final comments. And I ask you please to keep it short because we have to leave this room at 7:30. So Ronnie, you go ahead.
It's not a comment, it's a question.
Yeah.
Do you know how people pay in order to have those houses that you see, these massive houses, those 3 million, 5 million, 6 million of houses in Brazil, those houses in every country? How do they pay for that? Do you know that?
Yeah. No, I'm sorry.
He knows. Okay? Now, he knows, but probably he's wrong. You know, the question is that these people receive, first they are being, in order to be able to get access to this, they have to pay, they have to save certain amount of money regularly in a special account that the government controls. That is to show that they are responsible. So everybody living there is a responsible person. Okay? The second thing is that the government will make a great fuss of giving a subsidy as a sort of premium to the people who have been saving. The subsidy is a misery. It's a very small quantity.
So folks, we have a great challenge here to take up still, despite this enormous history, and because of this enormous history in some ways. There are many sources that we've tried to create over the last year in the 60th anniversary to talk about DPU's contribution, and I would like to just mention 2 of them. We flashed up this. There's a series called DPU Reflections Working Paper Series, which tries to capture the experience of my more senior colleagues who've been in the field for a very long time. And I think you'll find some of them very, very interesting. But we've tried to do it in another way as well. We have a project called Looking Back, Looking Forward. And it has been done by my colleague, Rita Lampert, who I think she was here, but she's not here at the moment. And through a series of interviews with our colleagues, and in fact, we will continue this project into the future, interviewing our current colleagues in terms of their contributions, but a very wonderful set of interviews, looking back at the field in which they operated and the kinds of thinking that they contributed to and the role of the DPU in that process. We're going to launch that project this week. So do keep an eye on the DPU social media. It will go live in a couple of days on our website. Looking back, looking forward, okay? And you'll be able to actually listen to Ronaldo and listen to Pat talking about some of these issues that they've raised today, but also others of our colleagues. So I'd like to thank you all for coming. I hope you'll join us at our next session in November, where we'll be focusing on the economic side, the city as the engine of economic growth, which was another very important contribution that the DPU made in the field of development, economics and development. And I understand that there might be another course wanting to come in here, so I just ask you please, if you wouldn't mind vacating quite quickly. Thank you so much.